supporters of Libra can provide some of that technology. But I think here what is important is to have an adequate division of labor. I think that efforts like what Libra is behind should take advantage of what really is working, what is not a hindrance to the final goal, for example, to have efficient cross-border payments, to have reduced fees for remittances, and have an adequate, I would say, collaborative effort. So our sense is that there are many goals that the project of Libra is behind that are worthwhile to embrace and that is worthwhile for us to fight for. But we should, at the same time, use all what we have that doesn't need to be invented again. That's the bottom line.
But there's a pretty clear sense that you and your, maybe not you, but your central banking colleagues are suspicious of Libra itself. They're not sure this is the right model.
Well, again, the issue is the currency by itself, it's Libra. I mean, I think all what needs to be done in terms of having an efficient currency to be used in a global payment systems, I think that is where we have to focus. Now, do we really need the global currency for that? I would say no. We already are in a position, the technology is already there for the currency play not to be an issue.
And I mean, regardless of the model of Libra, I mean, do you agree with my sense that, in a sense, Facebook has done central banks a favor to the extent that until Libra came along, central banks weren't really looking at innovating in this area, and since it's come along, there's been a huge competitive threat, it appears, from the outside, and now lots of central banks are looking at central bank digital currencies, and there seems to have been a huge push to innovation. I mean, is that a fair way of reading what's going on?
Well, I would say, I would say three things about this issue. One, central banks have been thinking of central bank digital currencies for quite some time.
But they haven't been doing very much about it until Libra came along.
Well, we have been at the wholesale level. At the retail level, and that's point number two, it doesn't seem to be an urgent need for that. I mean, as a matter of fact, when people do, what people want, what all of you want, is to be able to do 24-hour, 24/7 payments in a seamless way, instant way. And are we there? Yes, we are there. At the final moment, even when we have central bank digital currency, will the user say, I will prefer this because it's CBDC or it's because it's efficient? And the bottom line is because it's efficient. Now, number three, yes, central banks need to upgrade its play on this, but we need to do it in a smart way. We need to do it in a safe way. And yes, Libra, from that point of view, was a wake-up call, and yes, there is more effort now being deployed to the development of central bank digital currencies.
And so what has BIS's attitude been to central banks that have been at the vanguard of this? So here in Asia, I'm thinking in particular of the central bank in China, which has been quite, on the front foot, thinking about issuing its own central bank digital currency. I mean, are you encouraging central banks in the region to experiment, to in a sense, move ahead and launch these products?
Well, of course, we are very respectful of each jurisdiction. Each one faces their own problems. Certainly, we are very supportive of the efforts of the PBOC. As a matter of fact, we're also learning a lot of with them of what they are learning as they develop this. But each country has a different reality, and therefore each one needs to go at its own time. And again, I mean, there are countries, as we see here, we see many countries where the use of cash, for example, is falling very, very rapidly, but there are other countries where the use of cash is increasing. So, I mean, it's very difficult to generalize. What we need to do as central banks is to be ready. So, if we're ready technologically speaking, we're ready from a logistical point of view, we're ready from a regulatory point of view, that's what we need. And therefore, if the need is there to move faster on CBDC, we will be able to do so.
I'm just thinking about this region, so many of the people in the audience are going to be from Asia. in a sense, central banks in Asia, and particularly emerging Asia, have to be very alive to this. I mean, Libra, for example, most of its customers are in countries like India, or potential customers are in countries like India or Indonesia, and fintech may end up quite quickly becoming more systemically important in the financial systems of these large emerging markets as opposed to the Western markets. So is there a particular challenge for central banks in middle income and lower income economies here in Asia?
I mean, in a way, Asia is an example. I mean, I think many of the solutions, many of the objectives that the Libra type of projects want to achieve are already being achieved here. I mean, we have already examples at least at the national level where this is a reality. And I venture to say that very soon we will have cross-border experiences here in Asia that will do what Libra is promising to do, without the need of Libra. Now, what has been impressive here in Asia is the speed at which you have embraced technology and you have moved forward. I think technology is an aspect of society that blurs adjectives, blurs concepts. The issue of advanced economy versus emerging market in this field blurs. And I think what we have seen here in Asia is precisely, if you embrace technology in an efficient way, you can leapfrog dramatically. And I can say that in many Asian countries, there are technological solutions to payments, to different financial practices that are ahead of what you see in other advanced economies.
Can I ask you a bit about systemic risk? I mean, in a sense, you sound like you're quite enthusiastic about innovation in this area, playing to a gallery. But we've been here before the financial crisis. We got very enthused about financial innovation, and the end result of it turned out to be a big mess. I mean, to what extent are there systemic risks that you are worried about at the moment in the fintech space?
Well, I think precisely something that is needed is official involvement in this in a more definite way. We need to have a very close dialogue with society, with people like the one that is represented here today. And this is a good moment for me to introduce a concept that we're developing, which is the BIS Innovation Hubs. Basically, we'll be establishing innovation centers in different parts of the world. The first one outside the footprint of the BIS, which is Basel and Hong Kong, is here in Singapore. And why are we focusing here in Singapore? Because we see such a thriving effort, such a thriving entrepreneurs and thinkers where they can push the boundaries of what technology can do and what they can bring to financial aspects. Now we need to be close to those efforts so that we can digest them, incorporate in our way of doing business, and in a safe way bring to society this innovation. I mean, financial services are regulated because we're dealing with other people's money. And we need, the prime issue there is to preserve security. I mean, for example, when you send a chat from in one system, let's say I send you some form of message, if it doesn't arrive adequately, it doesn't happen anything. But if I send you a payment and you don't get the very last cent, you certainly will be upset and will complain to me. So we need to ensure that that is done in a safe way, and there is no room for mistake there.
And so one of the things, the new center that you're launching today, is you're looking at SupTech, supervisory technology. I mean, one of the challenges in fintech is you're moving from a world that has a very few large banks to one that is much more diverse. Lots of little companies doing lots of little things that the banks used to do. I mean, how do you cope with that? And I'm thinking in particular here about things like cyber risk amongst these small companies that have to now be regulated in the same way that you regulated banks.
A tendency that we're seeing is that commercial banks enter into partnerships or absorbing more activity from fintechs. And that certainly is very, very good. Now, the issue is that in the past, we used to have some form of surveillance about the resilience in cybersecurity and other aspects just by looking at the banks. But now the boundary is far bigger because now there are third-party providers. If the third-party providers do not have the same standard of security, then, you know, the chain is as strong as its weakest link. So we don't want to incur in risks by having weak links. So yes, that imposes a much higher bar for authorities to making absolutely sure that the system is resilient and is secure at all times.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. Can I circle back to the issue of systemic risk? So you talked about the center, but in a sense what I was driving at is across the piece, from payments at the top end to wholesale banking at the bottom, which are the systemic risks that you're most worried about as the fintech revolution progresses? I mean, where do central banks and in a sense the BIS where do you have to put your efforts?
Well, I mean, I think systemic risks from the point of view of inappropriate loans being granted in a massive scale and that putting the financial system at risk from a sustainability point of view, at this stage I see that as a relatively low risk. I think what is most important are operational risks. I mean, something that is extremely sensible from a society point of view, we need reliable payment systems. And that can be a really major problem. Now, that has more operational type of risks than definitely the type of risks that, for example, we were exposed to for the global financial crisis. So it's different types of risks, and therefore we have to adjust our focus of how to approach this issue to guarantee a safe financial environment.
And in our final 30 seconds, tell me the one thing that you're most excited about in this area. As you used to be a central bank governor, you're now in charge of the body that regulates central banks. What is it that you think is the most revolutionary technology in this area?
Well, I think technology really what it does is that it gives us a wider degrees of freedom to do our work better. What we need to do as authorities is to provide a trustworthy currency that provides an environment where financial activity can be conducted in a safe way for society's benefit. Sometimes technological developments, innovation might be hindered for security issues. But now with technology, I think technology provides us a very good instrument to allow precisely for innovation to move faster and in a more aggressive way without us worrying so much. So I think that this enhances the possibility of having more efficient and exciting payment systems, exciting financial practices, to have financial practices that cover a broader sectors of population. So this will help us to do our work in a much better way.
Very good. Augustine, one of the rules in Singapore is do not keep the Deputy Prime Minister waiting. So our time here is up. Many thanks to the audience for listening. Thank you very much for your concise answers, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, James.
As you know, economic theory has modeled itself on theoretical physics. It has sought to establish timelessly valid laws that govern economic behavior and can be used reversibly both to explain and to predict events. But instead of finding laws capable of being falsified through testing, economics has increasingly turned itself into an axiomatic discipline consisting of assumptions and mathematical deductions similar to Euclidean geometry. Rational expectations theory and the efficient market hypothesis are products of this approach. Unfortunately, they prove to be unsound. To be useful, the axioms must resemble reality. Euclid's axioms met that condition. Rational expectations theory doesn't. It postulates that there is a correct view of the future to which the views of the participants tend to converge. But the correct view is correct only if it is universally adopted by all the participants, an unlikely prospect. Indeed, if it is unrealistic to expect all participants to subscribe to the theory of rational expectations, it's irrational for any participant to adopt it. Anyhow, rational expectations theory was pretty conclusively falsified by the crash of 2008, which caught most participants and most regulators unawares. The crash of 2008 also falsified the efficient market hypothesis because it was generated by internal developments within the financial markets, not by external shocks, as the hypothesis postulates. The failure of these theories brings the entire edifice of economic theory into question. Can economic phenomena be predicted by universally valid laws? I contend that they can't be, because the phenomena studied have a fundamentally different structure from natural phenomena. The difference lies in the role of thinking. Economic phenomena have thinking participants. Natural phenomena don't. The thinking of the participants introduces an element of uncertainty that is absent in natural phenomena. The uncertainty arises because the participants' thinking doesn't accurately represent reality. In human affairs, thinking serves two functions, a cognitive one and a causal one. The two functions interfere with each other. The independent variable of one function is the dependent variable of the other. And when the two functions operate simultaneously, neither function has a truly independent variable. I call this interference reflexivity. Reflexivity introduces an element of uncertainty both into the participants' understanding and into the situation in which they participate. It renders the situation unpredictable by timelessly valid laws. Such laws exist, of course, but they don't determine the course of events. Economic theory jumped through many hoops trying to eliminate this element of uncertainty. It started out with the assumption of perfect knowledge, but as Frank Knight showed in his book Risk, Uncertainty and Profit, published in 1921, in conditions of perfect knowledge, there would be no room for profits. The assumption of perfect knowledge was replaced by the assumption of perfect information. When that proved insufficient to explain how financial markets anticipate the future, economists developed the theory of rational expectations. That's when economic theory parted company with reality. Some great thinkers, including Friedrich Hayek in his Nobel Prize speech, kept reminding economists of the importance of uncertainty. But advances in quantitative modeling led to the neglect of this Knightian uncertainty. That's because quantitative methods can't take into account any uncertainties that can't be quantified. Collateral debt obligations and credit default swaps and risk management methods produced by these quantitative approaches played a nefarious role in the crash of 2008. The meltdown of the financial system forces us to go back to the drawing board and look for a more realistic approach. I believe that we have to start with recognizing a fundamental difference between human and natural phenomena. This means that financial markets should not be treated as a physics laboratory, but as a form of history. The course of events is time-bound and one-directional. Predictions and explanations are not reversible. Some timelessly valid generalizations can serve to explain events, but not to predict them. I've started to develop a set of generalizations along these lines by introducing the concept of reflexivity. Reflexivity can be interpreted as a two-way feedback mechanism between the participants' expectations and the actual course of events. The feedback may be positive or negative. Negative feedback serves to correct the participants' misjudgments and misconceptions and brings their views closer to the actual state of affairs until, in an extreme case, they actually correspond to each other. In a positive feedback, a distortion in the participants' views causes mispricing in financial markets, which in turn affects the so-called fundamentals in a self-reinforcing fashion, driving the participants' views and the actual state of affairs ever further apart. What renders the outcome uncertain is that the feedback can't go on forever. Yet, the exact point at which it turns negative is inherently unpredictable. Such initially self-reinforcing, but eventually self-defeating boom-bust processes are just as characteristic of financial markets as the tendency towards equilibrium. Instead of a universal and timeless tendency towards equilibrium, equilibrium turns out to be an extreme case of negative feedback. At the other extreme, positive feedback produces bubbles. Bubbles have two components: a trend that prevails in reality and a misconception relating to that trend. The trend that most commonly causes a bubble is the easy availability of credit. And the most common misconception is that the availability of credit doesn't affect the value of the collateral. Of course it does, as we have seen in the recent housing bubble. But that's not sufficient to fully explain the course of events. I formulated a specific hypothesis for the crash of 2008, which holds that it was the result of a super bubble that started forming in 1980 when Ronald Reagan became president and Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The prevailing trend in the super bubble was also the ever-increasing use of credit and leverage. But the misconception was different. It was the belief that markets correct their own excesses. Reagan called it the magic of the marketplace. I call it market fundamentalism. Since it was a misconception, it gave rise to bubbles. So the super bubble was composed of a number of smaller bubbles and punctuated by a series of financial crises. Each time, the authorities intervened and saved the system by taking care of the failing institutions and injecting more credit when necessary. So the smaller bubbles served as successful tests of a false belief, helping the super bubble to grow bigger by reinforcing both credit creation and market fundamentalism. It should be emphasized that this hypothesis was not sufficient to predict the outcome of individual crises. For instance, I predicted that the emerging market crisis of 1997 would lead to a collapse of global capitalism, and I was wrong. Nor is it sufficient to fully explain actual outcomes. For that, one needs to take into account the specific historical circumstances. The hypothesis only helps to select the relevant circumstances. Let me illustrate this by examining the origins of the super bubble.